everybody. Hope you're doing well today. As I mentioned earlier today, I just wanted to give you a lecture video on the development of strength. So let's go ahead, shall we? So by the end of the lecture, I would like you to be able to describe and explain strength as a constraint to skilled performance, to be able to describe and explain the strength training effects across the lifespan, and also finally predict what will happen to performance if strength is limited. So being strong is actually really important, and in fact, professional athletes can be paid millions of dollars to display these large feats of strength. So there are differences in terms of from natural training and even those gains that have been associated with augmented performance by the use of performance enhancing drugs as one example. So there's a lot that would need to be considered, and let's just start right at the beginning. So just remember the growth curve that I showed you at the very beginning of this class, where you see from birth steady growth across as we age, and then you notice here that there's this sharp increase in the slope of this curve, indicating showing you this growth spurt. This growth that we see here is largely because of the increase in muscle mass. And before puberty, there's no difference between males and females, although that difference becomes larger after that point. Also, we know that the loss of muscle mass is quite dramatic after the age of 50. So, we know that muscle mass increases as we get older, and then there's a decrease in it as we age. But what about strength itself? So, I'd like you to take a couple of moments to think and reflect on what is strength as opposed to muscle mass. Okay. So a lot of skills that you perform, anything from activities of daily living to your chosen sport, requires a certain amount of strength to perform well. And in fact, more strength typically will translate to better performance. And it's really important to understand the relationship between muscle mass and strength. And as such, force depends on two general predictors: the number of muscle fibers that are activated, so thinking back to the recruitment of motor units, and the mechanical leverage associated with moving joints. So first off, we'll talk about cross-sectional area of activated fibers, and then the coordination between those fibers as well. So it makes sense that you have a larger cross-sectional area of a muscle would translate to larger muscular force. This change comes with growth and with training, as we know that with training, you have an increase in hypertrophy as one training adaptation, but also in the recruitment of motor units as well. But let's also consider other factors than growth that contribute to strength. So for example, can you think of any? We know that there are neurological factors may play a role, but you can also take a moment now to pause the video and come up with your own ideas. So to begin, strength is an individual constraint, and it's influenced by many things. It also depends on what you're doing and the environment around you. Therefore, strength must change across the lifespan to accommodate these changes. So, going back to the environmental constraints, I'd like you to take a moment to come up with one or two ideas yourself. So starting earlier on, by pre-adolescence, boys and girls typically show a similar degree of strength, and this only changes at about 13 years old, at which point boys show a slight strength advantage given the same height, and this has been demonstrated by many workers. And in fact, looking at this graph of isometric strength, so you have isometric force contraction measured in newtons on the y-axis and age in years on the x-axis. So performing different kinds of tasks such as hand grip, dynamometry, elbow extension, and leg lifts, you find that there's a marked difference later in the later years, so in the early to mid-teens, but by 8 years old, 10, and even 12, there's little to no difference at these age groups. But you tend to see this large jump in the boys' leg lift strength compared to girls. So, what does this correspond to in terms of the So what does this correspond to? What are some ideas that we can think of? So we know that there's this increase in the slope of the growth curve. Sorry, I'm using my mouse to draw this, so it's going to be very messy. What about some other factors you can think of? So, again, with higher muscle mass will relate to a larger degree of strength. In the study, here is one good example where Wood et al. Measured elbow flexor strength, muscle size, and moment arm length in a sample of boys and girls. And all these boys and girls were just shy of 10 years old, so the mean age was about 9.6 years. And they found that muscle size had the largest contribution to strength. And they measured muscle size by using MRI. Also, Barrett and Harrison found that children matched adults in strength per unit muscle volume. So for every cubic centimeter of muscle mass, the same amount of strength was present as it was in adults. So therefore, the size of the muscle is what contributes the largest contribution to the strength difference between children and adults. What about moment arm length? So in the same study, Wood and colleagues measured isometric elbow flexion in torque. So again, torque is just simply a force applied about an axis. And they measured torque at different joint angles. So 10 degrees, 50 degrees, and 90 degrees, and found that there's no difference between boys and girls at 10 degree of elbow flexion, so very acute angle. About 50 degrees, little less acute. There's this difference between boys and girls, and it persists at 90 degrees. So in elbow flexion, not really measuring which muscle is going, you see this difference in elbow flexion torque between boys and girls. So why don't you take a moment and try to interpret this graph yourself. What do you think this could mean? So thinking back to what you learned in biomechanics is that we know that let's just switch to the pin here, that torque equals, what do you think it might equal? So it could equal force, linear force, times the radius, the distance of the radius from the angle, from the rotation point. So if we think of that, then you could say that with the largest, where the moment arm is longest, would in turn translate to a larger torque. So if that's the case, then you would imagine that with boys in this case, appear to be having a longer moment arm. So this number would be larger in boys at certain angles of rotation. Okay, so given this knowledge, they found, Wood and colleagues measured the moment arm length of the brachialis muscle between boys and girls and looked at different joint angles and found what the brachialis had its largest moment arm at 90 degrees, just as what you would expect with respect to the biceps brachii as well. But this difference was largest at 70 degrees. So elbow flexor cross-sectional area was directly proportional to isometric torque at 50 degrees and 90 degrees. So, despite the fact that the contribution of moment arm length to torque is assessed only the brachialis muscle, which has frankly a small moment arm relative to the biceps brachii, approximately 19% of the variance in isometric torque at 90 degrees is explained. But it's also important to note that moment arm length is limited in its ability to explain any of the torque variance at 10 and 50 degrees. So it's not the only thing there, but it does explain some of the difference between boys and girls. So typically if you see this type of thing, boys obviously have a longer moment arm, which then should contribute to a larger torque. Other factor that might play into the difference between strength in boys and girls is what about the peak height velocity curve? So you have height gain in centimeters per year on the y-axis, and you have age in years. This peak right here in how quickly height will change, one question to ask is, does this coincide with strength gain? So could you use this in turn to predict a children's strength level by simply measuring their muscle mass? And you could also subtract fat-free mass from their fat mass, and will that give you an indication? What do you think? So, well, as it turns out, that these gains in height don't coincide with gains in strength. So i.e., with a peak muscle mass gain and strength, there's no agreement. So in fact, they're offset a little bit. And Rasmussen and colleagues found that your peak muscle mass velocity occurred at 14.3 years. However, muscle strength gain, the maximal gain was 14.7 years. So what do you think might account for this difference? Why don't you take a few moments and jot a few ideas down? Well, honestly, frankly, we don't really know. In fact, there is a suggestion that there's a lag in hormone level increases following muscle mass. So with more muscle mass, that changes the hormone levels related to muscular differentiation, which in turn explain the differences between boys and girls. How about the effect of practice or training? So looking at vertical jumping and sprinting, Asmussen and Hebel-Nielsen measured performance in different height groups and found that muscle strength was greater than the rate of gain in isometric strength. So the ability to use muscle strength in different contexts for different tasks is greater than the rate that gained in isometric contractions. So this is really emphasizing the role of the different neurological factors in muscle strength gains. So let me highlight this for you. So we know that, like earlier in the class, boys gain more muscle than girls do, just simply because of higher levels of androgen hormone secretion. So androgens like testosterone, for example. So it's no surprise then that boys undergo a spurt of increased muscle strength at about the age of 13. Therefore, because of this difference in growth in muscle mass, the average adult man is typically stronger than the average adult woman. And in fact, women can only produce between 60 and 80% of the force that men can. Although most of these differences can be attributed to differences in arm and shoulder strength rather than in the trunks or the legs. So men are typically stronger, but more so in the upper body strength, not necessarily lower body strength. So just to recap, between boys and girls, muscle mass difference is more markedly different in the arms and shoulders than the trunks and the legs. And in fact, the average difference in body or muscle size only counts for half of the difference. It could be that cultural norms likely play a significant role, or there's also the contribution of specific training. So you can think of yourselves some examples of what men and women can both achieve with respect when it comes to elite training. So you can take a few moments now to pause the video and think of some differences of whom you know, or examples of whom you know, that shows that women can do quite a bit like as men can do. However, when you account for these differences even at the elite level, men typically show higher strength than women. So let's just explore this, the effect of cultural norms on strength. So back in 1982, Shepard measured boys and girls' strength. So they wanted to look at test repetition on muscle force measurement. When repeated visits were measured, girls improved on these strength measures, whereas boys showed little to no change. So in back extension in the boys here versus that of girls, very quickly girls approached that performance achieved by the boys, even with training. Hip flexion again was not much different between boys and girls, but you see that this upper body strength can be done or can improve in girls quite quickly. So you can think of this as yourself. The traditional physical activities promoted to boys tend to provide long-term resistance training, whereas typically girls aren't given that, or either not shown that same opportunity. So these daily physical activities that promote strength do have a cumulative effect over the growing years. So that in turn does play some role in the differences between males and females that can't be contributed to muscle size alone. So knowing that, if you are a coach or a personal trainer, how might you work to overcome the stigmas associated with weight training in girls and women in order to help them improve their strength? So just to switch gears here, we're going to talk about middle and older adulthood. So during the 20s and 30s, strength is typically maintained. And after which you tend to see a very slight decline. But by the 50s, this loss can be between 18 and 20% of muscle mass. And in fact, there can be even up to 45% loss of strength after the age of 65, as reported by Murray and colleagues. So the changes in strength with aging, when you have, it really depends on what you do. Do you exercise? Do you perform different activities? So you can have better maintenance when you are physically active. You perform essentially just, if you're physically active, you'll tend to be able to maintain far better than those people who don't. So you tend to see greater decline with muscles that are used infrequently, whereas those you can maintain it better if the muscles are used frequently. Isometric strength tends to stay stable in older adults, but that dynamic strength and concentric contractions show a decline in strength. You also see power production falters in older adults, and even using larger joints or large changes in joint angle is observed. And likewise, female strength tends to show greater decline in older age than do males. So to illustrate this point, we see that older adults, you see this disparate age-related changes. You can tend to see that, so what you're doing is percent relative to young adults. So if anything is in the negatives, means you have worse performance than young adults. Anything that's better in the positive means better performance than, or increase relative to adults. So in triceps, brachii, you tend to see decreased in maximal voluntary contraction force and also reduced peak twitch tension. So this one in the purple here, in maximal voluntary contraction, you motivate and ask to motivate your participant to contract the triceps as hard as they can. Whereas in peak twitch tension, you apply an electrical impulse to see how much more strength can be activated beyond what a participant can do voluntarily. You also see a similar decline in the biceps and the quadriceps. However, what you do tend to see an increase in older adults in time to peak tension, so how long it takes for a muscle to contract, increase in how long a muscle will relax, as well as an increase in the entire contraction duration. And you see this markedly different in the lower limb muscles. Thus, this is probably likely contributing to the increased postural instability that you see in older adults. You can look at the same thing in knee extension. So if you look at peak torque extension at the knees So again, in Newton meters in the y-axis, and this is the joint angles. So here are where you have your knee angle is static, so participants have to maintain a joint angle, whereas you have isokinetic contractions. So isokinetic just simply means same force over the amount of joint angle traversed. So you can think of this as a concentric contraction. And you tend to see that with static contractions, you tend to see a drop, but even between 70-year-old adults and 77-year-old adults, you tend to see a drop in this decade as well. And this difference is far more marked when you do concentric contractions, even to the point where, in this case, individuals have much lower strength the faster they have to contract their muscles. And this was performed within the same individuals. So you have individuals were tested at 70 years of age, and then following up 7 years later, you see this drop. So you can think of what are the changes in the muscle tissue that might account for this. So you can think of the changes to the muscle fibers. So or the nervous system might be involved. So you can think of the nervous system might be involved because in older age you tend to see the death of alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, as an example. You can also have loss of muscle coordination, and even the vascular system might also be involved. So the number of capillary beds per muscle fiber seems to decline as we age. Or it could be other factors might play a role. So if you like to think of some yourself, you can pause the video and we'll continue on. So here's just a schematic given what could lead to a decrease in muscle strength. We know that muscles atrophy, so they get smaller as we age. The changes in muscle fiber characteristics, so you lose those fast twitch type 2 fibers, and you also have changes in blood flow to the muscle, changes in the nervous system as well. So, i.e., the death of alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. So here are some really proximate factors that play in the role in decreased muscle strength, but also you can think of a decrease in physical activity plays a role, either directly and indirectly, mediated by these changes. There's also a risk factor increase in different types of disease, so cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and the like. Obesity, and even related to this is poor nutrition, can affect this. So what can be done to alleviate the age-related decrease in muscle strength? And in fact, the answer is obviously training. So training can increase muscle strength with this training. And at first it was originally thought to be only due to circulating testosterone, but this training effectiveness isn't limited to young adult males. So, and in fact, you can see quite a bit of differences in strength training for older adults. So, and I'll go through a few examples here. So, we know that strength training is an individual constraint to performance. And strength interacts with the task, what you're doing, and the environment you find yourself in. If strength is modifiable, then it can therefore change your performance. And in fact, what this means is you can just simply change where strength becomes a rate limiter. So what do I mean by that? So by training, you can increase your strength capacity such that it won't be as much of a limit to what you can do. And this becomes more and more evident, especially when you're trying to do elite performance, or later in life when you're an older adult. Having more strength typically will predict a longer lifespan. You can even see changes even very early in life. So found that children as young as 6 and 7 years old can increase their strength with training. They used weights, machines, and isometric contractions. So in blue here, the blue bars are the control group, and the purple bars indicate data from those children who were trained. And you found that with training, you do tend to see an increase in strength. So we know that strength is greater in prepubescent boys than pubescent and postpubescent boys. And in this task, they were trained on universal machines and free weights, 9 weeks for 3 days a week, and did 3 sets of 10 repetitions. So here you could see is that the percentage increases in strength here. Generally, so these prepubescent boys in the purple generally achieved larger relative increases in strength of the 4 muscle groups shown here. So what can account for this? So we noted previously that strength is related to muscle size and to the central nervous system's ability to activate muscles fully. So this improvement that you see in prepubescent boys likely can be from their improved ability to exert force in the intended direction. So they're better able to contract an agonist muscle and also coordinate the antagonist. And in fact, it's probably these factors that might account for much of the initial strength gain when males or females of any group begin training. Are there negative effects of strength training, especially for young children? I mean, you could think their bones are still growing. Could they be susceptible to injury? What about traumatic injury or repetitive chronic injury? Will they lose their flexibility? So what we can see now is that there's no documented damage to bones or muscles in training. And in fact, in this study, they accounted that 1 minor injury occurred in over 2 years of training at twice a week. And they found that there's also no loss of flexibility. In adolescence, we typically see that hypertrophy accompanies regular strength training. So, a question you can ask, do adolescent boys add far more muscle mass than girls? And does that mean there is a difference in the response to training? Looking at differences between young men and women, you found that young men and women performing at 70 to 90% of their 1 repetition maximum, the rate at which strength was gained was the same between males and females. However, men saw greater gains in terms of absolute values. So if you just look at how much a man could lift versus a woman of the similar height, men could lift more weight than a woman can, but only when you look at it in absolute values. Here. and into going into older adulthood, you can maintain or even gain strength through resistance training. And in fact, male soldiers in their middle age were able to improve push-up performance and leg power with a 12-week program. So what they did was these different exercises at 4 to 5 sets or 3 to 5 sets of 5 to 10 repetitions with 2 to 3 minutes of rest. And what they were able to find is that when they looked at changes in, they looked at vertical jump height after training, and what they found is that in the filled bars you have pre-testing or pre-training, and in the white bars you have post-training. And you saw that you had increases in vertical jump height when people were doing resistance training and other types of training here. And if you looked at resistance training alone, you had an increase in strength. Okay, so how about in older adults? In older adults, you can typically see, you have to ask yourself, can older adults prevent or reverse losses in muscle mass and strength through training? Mayer and colleagues performed a meta-analysis and looked at about 1,500 different studies and wanted to study how effective, ask the question, how effective is resistance training in older adults? As you would expect, there's a dose-response relationship. Specifically, you had a higher response when you did high-intensity training. So high intensity meaning greater than 75% of their maximum strength capacity. So this stimulus will trigger larger increases in strength than low or moderate intensities. So here's that table from that meta-analysis, and they found that looking at these different studies or looking at maximal strength, what they would do is just simply look at the means and the standard mean difference between low intensity versus high intensity. And what you simply perform is just an average of what the difference in the means, looking at the difference between the different types of training. So in this case, you're looking at high intensity minus low intensity, and you see this difference. If this interval here doesn't cross the 0 point, then it's a statistically significant difference. And if you're doing a meta-analysis over many studies, what you simply do is perform a mean of all these, and you find that here there is about a modest effect where you see training would favor a high intensity mode than low intensity. You also see perhaps a marginal difference with stair climbing ability as well. And likewise here. So, to summarize, strength development. So, there's 5 general phases. You have an increasing strength through childhood. You tend to see in adolescence, girls continue a steady increase, whereas boys have a spurt of strength gain, particularly in the upper body. Strength stabilizes in the 20s and 30s. And up to the 50s, you see a gradual decline. And at ages 50 or more, you typically see a steeper loss in strength. However, resistance training can change this typical pattern. And the changes in strength parallels the muscle mass changes. We know that neurological factors will play a role, so do cultural norms, and strength is important for skilled performance. So is flexibility, and that'll be on our next lecture video.